Imagine a world where the Strait of Hormuz is completely blocked. Oil spikes to $128 a barrel, and, well, you suddenly realize something terrifying.
You're right. The realization that we are still completely tethered to this single commodity.
Exactly. You realize that even if every car on Earth magically went electric tomorrow, your hospital, your cosmetics, and your food supply would still grind to a halt without this black gold.
It's a sheer, visceral geopolitical shock. I mean, watching it unfold right now in April 2026 proves just how fragile our modern civilization really is.
It really does. So I'm so glad you're joining us for this. Today is Monday, April 27, 2026. And I want to confirm right off the bat that the extensive research and data collection for today's sources was also conducted today, April 27, 2026.
And my role today is to really dig into that data, parse through the noise, and analyze the underlying mechanics of this whole global energy ecosystem.
Perfect. You are tuned in to Macroeconomy AI, and the title of today's deep dive is Diving into Oil.
And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this journey.
We really do. Oh, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to check out our sponsor for today's episode, Deep Dive Apex Macro Analytics.
Right. When the world feels volatile, Apex brings you clarity.
Exactly. Apex Macro Analytics provides institutional-grade data modeling for the modern professional. Head to the link in our notes to learn more. And we are just incredibly proud of our mission here, bringing a compilation of analyses and news on macroeconomics, technology, and artificial intelligence.
And taking those macroeconomic models and applying them to the current Hormuz crisis, well, the physical reality is just staggering.
It's terrifying. I mean, shedding in 9.1 million barrels per day.
Yeah, that's nearly 20% of the entire global oil supply just erased from the board overnight. The International Energy Agency actually assessed that this crisis is worse than the historic oil shocks of 1973, 1979, and 2022 combined.
Wait, combined? That is wild.
It is. The arteries of international trade are just more integrated now, so they're way more fragile.
So we're seeing Brent crude peaking at this eye-watering $128 a barrel. And the downstream effects are immediate, right? It's not just the gas pump.
No, not at all. It creates cascading inflationary pressure everywhere. Central banks are basically forced to keep monetary policy strict because the cost to just move physical goods across the planet has skyrocketed.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because there's this huge myth out there that oil is just fuel. Like people hear $128 a barrel and say, oh, we just need to buy more EVs.
I see that assumption constantly. People think rapid adoption of alternative transport will quickly decouple us from these supply shocks.
Right. And we know EV sales surpassed 20 million units globally in 2025. That's like 1 in every 4 cars sold.
It's a huge technological shift for sure. Yet the data shows global oil demand actually continued to grow through 2025 and into 2026.
Which seems completely backwards until you look at the petrochemical supply chain. Oil isn't just the fuel for the delivery truck. It's the plastic packaging, the road beneath the tires, the product itself.
Exactly. Crude oil goes through fractional distillation. Only a part of it becomes transportation fuel. The rest, like the naphtha fraction, is the foundational feedstock for, well, modern manufacturing.
You literally cannot forge a wind turbine blade or make the synthetic resins for a solar panel without petrochemicals.
Right. Or the lightweight polymers used in those 20 million electric vehicles. You need intensive reliance on petrochemicals for all of it.
Our sources call it the everything molecule, which is so brilliant. Just look at a hospital. And aspirin is literally a derivative of benzene, which is a petrochemical.
Yeah, the sterile plastics in IV bags, cosmetics using paraffin, the synthetic fibers in surgical masks.
Almost 99% of pharmaceutical raw materials are fundamentally tied to petroleum. And farming, too. It's not just the diesel for the tractor.
Right. The synthetic fertilizers that sustain crop yields for 8 billion people are derived from natural gas and petrochemical processes.
So when a disruption like the Strait of Hormuz happens, capital markets freak out and aggressively seek non-OPEC production centers, right?
Exactly. They have to stabilize the global supply. And this brings us to a massive macroeconomic pivot we're seeing in the 2025 and 2026 data.
Right, because the U.S. is still #1, producing like 13.58 million barrels per day. Russia is 2, Saudi Arabia is 3.
But the most consequential shift is further down the list. Brazil has firmly cemented itself at number 9.
Which is huge. They produced 3.75 million barrels a day in 2025, and then jumped to 3.953 million by January 2026.
That volume growth is staggering, and it's entirely driven by their offshore pre-salt reserves.
The geology of this is what blows my mind. The Brazilian pre-salt is like drilling on alien terrain.
It really is an engineering marvel. They're operating in ultra-deep water, going down 2,000 meters just to reach the ocean floor.
And this is the crazy part. They drill through up to 2 kilometers of a massive subterranean salt layer.
Yeah, just to reach the oil reservoirs beneath it. Roughly 150 million years ago, when South America and Africa split apart, these massive shallow seas evaporated repeatedly.
Leaving behind this immensely thick crust of salt, right?
Exactly. And that salt acts as a perfect impermeable seal. It trapped organic matter under immense pressure, preventing the lighter hydrocarbons from escaping.
So it creates these highly pressurized reservoirs of low-sulfur, sweet crude oil that refineries absolutely love.
Precisely.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Isn't that insanely expensive? Operating a massive floating production platform and FPSO in those conditions. How is Brazil competitive with places like Texas or Saudi Arabia?
Well, you have to separate the initial capital expenditure from the lifting cost. The lifting cost is the day-to-day expense to bring a barrel up once the well is built.
Oh, I see. So the upfront cost is huge, but then what?
Because these pre-salt reservoirs are sealed under such extreme pressure, the oil essentially forces itself to the surface at a phenomenal rate.
The data confirms that, right? Sources say pre-salt wells average an astonishing 17,800 barrels a day per single well.
That kind of flow rate completely changes the break-even math. The massive upfront cost is amortized over millions of barrels very quickly.
Wow. So it brings Brazil's break-even price, like the minimum price needed to be profitable, below $40 a barrel.
Below $40, yes, making it highly competitive, especially when you compare it to U.S. shale oil.
Because shale relies on hydraulic fracturing, right? Pumping water and sand to break apart tight rock.
Yeah, and the physical nature of shale means the oil flow declines incredibly fast. A shale well might lose 60% of its production capacity in just the first year.
So to maintain production, U.S. operators have to constantly drill new wells. It's a continuous, massive capital drain.
Exactly, which keeps the break-even price for new U.S. shale investments hovering around $50 to $60 a barrel.
Okay, so if prices drop, U.S. shale is way more vulnerable than the massive, sustained flow of the Brazilian pre-salt.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense why Petrobras is doubling down.
Oh, they are aggressively doubling down. Their 2025 to 2029 strategic plan is a $111 billion gamble.
And 70% of their exploration and production capital is dedicated right to the pre-salt. But that collides directly with global environmental pressures, right?
It does. Global CO2 emissions hit a record 38.4 billion tons in 2025. Expanding this deep water extraction carries a huge localized environmental cost.
Yeah, the gas flaring. The sources showed gas flaring in Brazil jumped 27% in January 2026 alone.
Right, mostly due to the commissioning of their new P-78 platform, because when you pull up crude oil from these pressurized reservoirs, massive amounts of natural gas come up with it.
And if you don't have the subsea pipelines built out to transport that gas to the mainland, you basically have no choice but to burn it off or flare it on the platform.
Exactly, otherwise you risk a catastrophic explosion. But this creates a really profound tension within Petrobras's own strategy.
I was so fascinated by this contradiction in the sources. Petrobras has this new energy transition directorate aiming for 8 to 11% clean energy by 2050.
Yes, their argument is that the immense cash flow from this highly efficient pre-salt oil is the only realistic way they can afford to fund large-scale renewables like offshore wind.
So what does this all mean? They are essentially funding the green revolution with the profits of the black gold.
That is the paradox. But pouring $111 billion into fossil fuels creates massive physical and financial liabilities for the future, like decommissioning.
Decommissioning.
Yeah.
Right, the billions needed to safely dismantle these old offshore platforms when they retire.
It's a looming financial black hole. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, flexible risers, wellheads that must be permanently sealed with specialized cement.
And doing that across dozens of pre-salt fields over the next 30 years. That's staggering. And then there's the geopolitical side, like this historical carbon debt debate.
Right. The idea that international frameworks might eventually assess financial penalties on producers based on their cumulative historical emissions.
Which should lead to future carbon taxes on oil majors, completely upending their 30-year profitability models.
It's a massive macro-level risk, but we also need to look at the ground level, because the wealth from Petrobras flows into the state. But how does it affect the people?
Yeah, the local resource curse. The sources shared this mind-blowing stat. Royalties are pouring into municipalities. Places like Maricá and Niterói receive over 200 million reais every single quarter.
It's an astronomical influx of cash.
BUT, 12 of the 50 cities that receive the most royalties actually have living conditions below the national average. How is that possible?
Economists call it the Dutch disease. It's when a massive influx of external capital fundamentally distorts the local economy. It artificially inflates the cost of real estate, goods, and services.
So the oil sector pays wages that local agriculture or manufacturing just can't match.
Exactly. Those secondary industries wither away. The municipality becomes hyper-dependent on a single volatile commodity. If fiscal management is weak, the population suffers despite the statistical wealth.
It creates this fragile microeconomy. And honestly, that municipal dependence perfectly mirrors the ultimate macro risk for Brazil as a nation. Stranded assets in 2050.
A stranded asset is basically an economic resource that suffers a premature devaluation. And there are two fiercely conflicting scenarios for 2050.
Let's start with the IEA scenario. The International Energy Agency says to hit climate goals, oil demand must drop 13.4% annually until 2050.
If that happens, global prices crash, and Brazil's massive pre-salt reserves could become economically worthless. It would cost more to extract a barrel than the market would pay.
Right. But then you have the OPEC scenario, which is something completely different.
OPEC projects that fossil fuels will still supply 70% of the world's energy for decades.
Because of the global south, right?
Yeah.
Billions of people in developing nations are urbanizing and building out infrastructure.
Exactly. You cannot forge the steel and cement required to build megacities using just lithium-ion batteries and solar arrays. The energy density of petroleum is unmatched.
So Brazil is in this dual race. They have to pump the oil while it's still valuable to fund the nation, while navigating international pressure to protect biomes.
Right, like the intense geopolitical debate right now over whether they can drill in the equatorial margin in the north.
It's a complete tightrope.
It is. Oil is not just a fuel in transition. It is an incredibly complex global ecosystem. The 2026 crisis proves how vulnerable the world is, and Brazil sits at the very center of this geopolitical and economic tightrope. As a reminder to you listening, today's material is purely an informational and educational compilation from third-party sources. We have no ideological bias. This does not constitute investment or financial advice of any kind. Projections are subject to frequent revisions based on new data, and past performance is never a guarantee of future results. This discussion does not substitute specialized legal, economic, or technical consulting.
Absolutely. It's so important to keep that context in mind. This single molecule dictates everything from deep water engineering to the price of our groceries.
It touches literally every sector of the modern economy.
It really does. So I'll leave you with a final thought to mull over. If 99% of our pharmaceutical raw materials and our agricultural fertilizers rely entirely on the petrochemical industry, are we spending too much time trying to replace the gas tank in our cars while completely ignoring the hospital and the farm?
That is a profound question and definitely the crux of the energy transition debate.
It's something we'll be dealing with for decades. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. We invite you to join us for future explorations.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
That was today's Macroeconomy AI. We'll leave it here. You all stay well and keep an eye out for our new broadcasts. Subscribe to our channel, access the links, and follow Macroeconomy AI on social media. Bye.